We're back with another 2 dead Ryobi batteries, this time in smaller 1.5 ampere hour flavour. Can we fix them? Let's find out! Made in 2016 and 2017, these are the weedy stepbrothers of the 5 ampere hour batteries I worked with in another video. If you haven't seen that one, there's a link to it on screen now. They're a bit trickier to diagnose owing to the lack of LED charge level indicator. These are frequently supplied as starter batteries with cheaper Ryobi tools and cost around half of the 5 ampere hour version. These two are completely dead, the charger doesn't even detect them. At 1.5 ampere hours they hold under a third of the charge of their larger stablemates. They'll work fine in smaller tools, but you'll quickly find you run out of juice with drills, jigsaws, hedge cutters, that kind of thing. Jumping straight in, I was absolutely flummoxed by this last screw. Along with the security Torx bit being needed for all 5, Ryobi capped off one screw of both batteries with this little annoying plastic plug, and removing it really tested my mental tenacity. I could cut this bit out and pretend it all went smoothly, but where's the fun in that? Still fighting, and losing.
"75 years later."
After an embarrassingly long sequence not a million miles away from watching a raccoon trying to get into a jar of peanut butter, I finally won, but again, I don't think I deserve the mercy of cutting out what felt like an endless fight. I'd assumed it was a sticky cap, not a plastic plug all along, but I did figure it out eventually. The most important thing is I didn't let the frustration get to me. Right, let's have a look at what's under the cover. Largely similar to the 5 ampere hour version, the circuitry and wiring looks to be a decent quality and specification, the cables being nice and chunky, along with what appears to be a well-made connector post and housing. The circuit board itself is a bit shorter than the larger variants, with the LED charge level indication missing, keeping that headline price down. Companies like Ryobi want to draw people into their ecosystem at the lowest possible initial price point. Once they're hooked and have a few tools, people will then want to buy the larger batteries to make their collection more practical in everyday use. Also similar to the larger capacities, the MOSFETs used in this battery pack are over-specified for the application. Never a bad thing. Both MOSFETs appear to be in good condition. Removing the connector post to have a better look at the circuit board, it's pretty clear why this pack has bitten the dust. Yet another that suffered liquid ingress with those telltale deposits all over the PCB and various components. These deposits can cause either short circuits or parts of the circuit to have a lower resistance than they should have. This will cause parasitic drain, often taking cells well below their safe minimum voltage. Certainly seems we've got a bit of that going on here. Check out those charge levels. Well below what even the toughest lithium-ion cells are rated to deal with. At this point I'm not really sure they'll have survived being in this state for an unknown length of time. Let's start by separating the cells from the PCB. We want to try and bring them back to life without upsetting the battery management circuitry. The joyous lead-free solder has been used here, judging by how hard it is to melt anyway. So as usual, I make up for my weedy iron by adding some 60-40 solder to the mix, giving it a good stir, and then sucking the mixture away. Leaded solder isn't particularly dangerous. A friend of mine who's big in his electronic reworking told me to handle 60-40 solder like you'd handle poop. It won't do you any harm if you're careful and wash your hands properly. The main positive connection to the circuit board is threaded within some sort of cage. I'm guessing to give a bit more resilience when it comes to vibration and the like. At the factory I'm betting it was easy enough to assemble. but with solder soaked between each strand of wire, it was an absolute pig to remove. The fight lasted a while. Again, maybe I should have cut this out to make myself look semi-competent, but where's the fun in that? Life without self-deprecation just isn't worth living. After what absolutely wasn't 5 minutes, we finally have it separated. Hopefully the others aren't quite as much of a battle as this was. We'll do the same with the thinner battery balancing connections. A bit of solder. Carefully pull the wire away while still applying heat. And get rid of any solder remaining to make reconnection easier later. I'm not too worried about the heat making its way back to the cells. The connections, especially for balancing, aren't sufficiently thick to carry the quantity of heat that would cause issues. Likewise, the plastic battery cage also seems to be very heat resistant, with no deforming or melting evident. Now we're dealing with the negative connection. A large area of the circuit board around this carries current to the connector post, so there's a lot of heat soak happening as I'm trying to melt the solder. After mixing in some 60-40, I finally get it all melted, removing what I can, and then I figure it's going to be easier to have the PCB detached from the plastic cage so I can lever it away while applying heat. Oops, completely forgot to remove the thermistor attached to one of the cells for temperature monitoring. And the circuit board is finally free. Time for a quick tidy up of the various connectors before the next step. Right, let's see if we can bring those cells back to life. The cell specifications are on screen, but owing to the very low state of charge, I'll be trickling in a tiny amount of current to begin with, and increasing this in steps once I've confirmed they're not getting too hot. A hot cell is an angry cell, and I don't need to tell you that these things can become your worst enemy if you piss them off. I've sped this bit of footage up as it took a long time to get a decent level of charge into the cell. Working with them one at a time lets you see if there are any completely beyond saving, as well as being able to make sure they're evenly balanced in terms of charge. While charging, I regularly check how warm the cell is. As long as it's not uncomfortable to touch, you're good to continue carefully adding charge. Once the charging current dropped below 2 amps at 3.5 volts, I moved on to the next one, confident that it was at least holding some charge. With a bit of a better understanding of how the cells are behaving, I'm starting off at 2 volts, waiting until the current drops right down to practically nothing, then nudging the voltage up to 2.5, waiting for the current to dip to half an amp, increasing the voltage to 3 volts, waiting until it gets down to 1 amp, and finally 3.5 volts until it dips just below 2 amps. Not an exact science by any means, but the constant current function on this bench power supply is iffy at best, and I feel this is the safest way to get a similar level of charge into each cell. This part took a very long time, however it seemed to be worth the effort as I checked each cell off camera once they'd settled and they were all at very similar voltages. Now we can chuck a bit of charge into the battery as a complete unit. I did persevere with getting the constant current function working for this part of the process, but it seems the potentiometer behind the current control knob is either faulty or has a bad connection, as its adjustment is very erratic and a little bit unpredictable. Not ideal when you're trying to bring 5 potential firecrackers back to life. I'm checking each cell's temperature as I go. They're not heating up much at all and the voltages are still very even, so I'll keep adding charge and take the pack up to a total of 18.8 volts. That'll be plenty for the battery charger to pick up when it's all back together, so let's take a look at that circuit board and try to get it working again. You know it's serious when the MyProtein tub and toothbrush come out. This is the back of the circuit board. I completely neglected to look at it until now, but you can clearly see the areas contaminated with residue from water that's long since evaporated. After a good spray of IPA, the rubbing alcohol kind, not beer, and yes, I'm going to continue to make that joke, we're using the softest toothbrush I can find to clean the residue away. I'm sure some of you will groan at this, but I've used this technique on many PCBs over the years and it's always given decent results. As long as you don't apply too much pressure, you shouldn't disturb any components. Just go slow and steady and let the IPA do the work. We're going to do 3 passes on each side of the circuit board as there's a lot of residue to deal with. Before even going near the soldering iron after this, make sure all the parts that have been in contact with the alcohol are completely dry or put safely out of the way. I always wait at least half an hour if using the same workspace just to be on the safe side, and as you can see here I use an air duster to get rid of most of the liquid before leaving it to dry naturally. Here's the finished article. I'm sure you'll agree it looks almost as good as new, but will it work? It seems I was feeling a bit lazy earlier. I completely forgot to clean out the slot in which the negative battery connection fits, so we'll need to sort that before anything else. As always, it's happily sapping away every ounce of heat that I can apply, deep joy. But I've got this far, and I'm not going to let it win now. After a quick final check, and a moment to admire that shiny PCB one last time, I'll resolder the connections one by one in the hope I've done enough to bring this pack back into service. I foresaw the main positive connection being an issue, and I was correct. Due to the fact it had previously been soldered, the wire was too large to fit back into the cage. I did try, but it absolutely was not happening. The next best solution was simply to solder it alongside the cage. While not ideal because the joint will be subject to vibration, as long as you use a decent amount of solder, it should be okay for the remaining life of the battery. Next, it's time to resecure the PCB to the battery cage, reconnect the charge balancing wires, making sure they're slotted into the retaining channels to protect them against vibration, and reattach the thermistor to one of the cells. Clip the connector post back into the circuit board, and the battery pack's ready to be put back in its housing. Here's the bottom part of the housing. An odd, but in my opinion, good change from the 5Ah pack is the metal springs for the release buttons are attached firmly to the housing rather than just being left loose and a bit of a pain to reattach during assembly. The release buttons slot into place alongside the springs, and after a quick test press we can refit the top housing section. Five screws later and we're back in business. And nope, I'm not going to refit that daft little plastic plug to one of the screw holes. Crunch time, will the pack charge? Yes, yes it will! Happy days! And the final test, let's pop it in the Ryobi drill and see what happens. Fantastic! She lives! One down, one to go. Here's number 2! Identical to the first, both in specification and current level of functionality. This one's also completely dead, being unrecognised by the charger. At this point I was confident it'd be a cookie cutter job of the first battery, but there's a bit of a surprise in store with this one. All looking normal so far, the case isn't damaged, all screws are present, and there's no signs of burning to any of the connectors. It didn't take me long until I encountered the dreaded plastic bung of doom. Armed with the rage-inducing memories of fighting with it half an hour ago, this one didn't stand much of a chance. And we're in, but it's not great news. I thought the last pack had a lot of liquid ingress evidence. This one was on a whole other level. It's all over the board, top and bottom, and in my experience when it's this bad you start to see corroded components and other problems that aren't quite as easy to fix as a PCB cleanup and battery recharge. Let's dive straight in, get the battery pack out of its housing and start to remove the PCB. I've had the foresight to let the iron build up a bit more heat this time, it's only taken me 3 batteries to learn that, by removing smaller connections first and the larger positive and negative connections afterwards. As always, I'm mixing in that 60-40 solder before suckering the lot off. This makes light work of the balancing connections and helps a lot with the chunkier main positive and negative terminals too. I'm giving the iron a minute to build up some heat, and this gets the problematic positive connection off without too much aggro. But would the negative play ball? After removing the 4 small screws holding the circuit board to the battery cage, we'd find out. And the answer is a resounding yes. Once the thermistor is removed from the cell it's attached to, the circuit board can just be lifted away. Now, let's check those cells. The voltages are a bit of a surprise, showing us over 3 volts each, with a good balance between them all. So why isn't the pack registering with the charger? It's got to be the circuitry, but first, let's pop a little top-up charge into those cells. Although they're not dangerously low, there's a chance the battery management isn't happy with them being at the level they currently are, so we'll slowly bring it up to 19 volts, or 3.8 volts per cell. Partway through I'm checking they're still balanced. Yep, pretty much spot on. As with the first battery, I'm also keeping an eye on the temperature by regularly touching each cell. They're barely lukewarm, which isn't a surprise as they're very good quality LG components. And here's the main suspect, the circuit board, complete with lots of residue from dried out water ingress. Old Faithful's back, ready to scrub away at the layers of detritus that might well be causing our present headache. I'm giving this one 3 very thorough passes, rinsing the brush between each cycle, and also applying copious amounts of IPA to the PCB as I go. It's a very fine line between scrubbing hard enough to remove the deposits and damaging or knocking off some of the smaller surface mounted components from the circuit board. Thankfully, no damage was done during this process, as far as I can see anyway. The air duster is used to remove the majority of the alcohol from the PCB, and I let it air dry for another half hour or so before proceeding to make sure it's all evaporated. In my haste, I'd not cleaned up the mounting slot for the negative connection, again. Time to fire up the soldering iron and remove as much of the old solder as possible. Thanks to this, the board slips nicely into place. A good dollop of 60-40 to reconnect it, and we're in business. The positive connection is being done the same way as it was on the first battery. There's no way it'll fit back in that cage on the connector, so we'll solder it alongside instead. The small balancing connections are as easy as ever, and as always I made sure the small wires were clipped back into their respective channels to protect them from vibration. Before popping the housing back on, I need to reinsert the 4 small screws holding the PCB in place on the battery cage, along with sticking the thermistor back in place of course. Bottom housing back in place. Release buttons slotted back into their location against the springs. Top housing back on. And finally, those all-important 5 Torx screws. And again, that small plastic cap will stay in the bin where it belongs. I didn't have much hope for this one given the state it was in. But wow, it's charging! And the load test? Passed. Absolutely fantastic news. Another 2 out of 2 saved. Although they're the most basic battery Ryobi offer, these are always handy as a backup. Another 2 for the collection. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video and want to see similar content in future, don't forget to subscribe and I'll catch you next time. Cheers!